Greetings. This is Hitendra Wadhwa, and welcome to Intersections. We call this podcast Intersections because so many times we get very confined and limited, sometimes unconsciously, if not consciously, because of silos, because of boundaries, because we get so caught up in certain boxes that we trap ourselves in. And therefore, the role of intersections is to help us dissolve those boundaries, to zoom out and see things from a more integrative and more whole lens. Because when we do that, flashes of new insights, new connections, new creativity, and possibilities emerge. Today, it is my great pleasure to actually hand over the hosting responsibility to a dear friend, a colleague, and mentor, Raghu Krishnamoorthy. Raghu is the former CHRO of GE. Over the course of a few decades at GE, he established a remarkably successful path for himself, going all the way from being, at some stage, for example, the CHRO for GE Aviation, which is when I first got to know him. Then the chief learning officer for GE, the chief talent officer, the chief human resource officer for GE Healthcare, and ultimately for the whole global enterprise. And he moved on from there upon retirement to both pursue a PhD in leadership at University of Pennsylvania, as well as a partnership with my team and I at Mentora Institute, where he has been a beloved colleague as an executive director and a senior executive coach. So Raghu has since then graduated. He's now Dr. Raghu Krishnamoorthy. He's also taken over stewardship as the director of the Chief Learning Officer program at University of Pennsylvania, while simultaneously working with my team and I and our clients at Mentora. So Raghu, it is a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for joining us today, and let's welcome you into the show.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Hitendra. It's a real pleasure to be back at Intersections after a gap of a couple of years. And, you're right. It's a lot has gone by in the last 2 years, including me now turning to an academic career, like yourself in many ways, and learning from you along the way. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you, and I'm looking forward to a wonderful discussion over the next hour or so.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to hand over now the reins to you. Raghu was kind enough to say, Hitendra, let me actually steward the show, and then that way draw some things out from you, because you've just come out with a book, and we want to talk about that among so many other important things around the future of leadership that, Raghu, you're going to weigh in on. So I'm happy to do that. Just before I do that, I do want to say, what I've seen over the last 2 years is just this incredible passion you have for learning, this curiosity that makes you interview and get so much of being a sponge-like sort of soaking in of all kinds of thinking from others, trends and themes out there, and then repackaging them in a way that allows us to make sense of our complicated times. And it's a gift to have you with us, Raghu. Floor is yours.
Thank you for those kind words. And I must also congratulate you right now for coming out with such an important book for our times, right? So I think we'll certainly have a chance to discuss about where my own research and your book coincides, and we'll, I'm sure, have a very interesting conversation on some of the things I'm uncovering, which gets addressed very well in the book, and we'll certainly enjoy that part of the conversation as well. So the way I thought of structuring this discussion over the next however long it takes, and I'm sure we'll invite questions from the audience as well, is to talk about three things. First is to house the whole discussion in the current context. And I call it living in the age of unreality. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. And after we set the context, understand where we are and where we are going, by the way, I don't think anybody has a clue on where we are going. If somebody pretends they have, they are perhaps not sharing the truth. But I think there are some pointers that we would perhaps have some understanding of. And then from there, I want to talk about what does it mean for us as people, as humankind. So I'm going to talk about the age of unfolding. COVID has been a phenomenal, tragic, often humanitarian crisis. Having said that, it's also a natural experiment that has caused many of us to pause and reflect on who we are and what we want to be. So I think there is an unfolding that is going on. If there's anything good that has come out of the last 2-3 years, it's certainly a search within. and what is that unfolding looking like in the workplace is something that we'll touch upon. And that's where I'll bring in some of the stuff that you have written, Hitendra. And finally, from there, I'm going to talk about the age of unlearning. And that's where I'm going to talk about the fact that we have to unlearn management and relearn leadership for the new era that we are going into. So, those are the three facets of this discussion. So, let me start by giving some statistics. And I don't know whether you read just yesterday, Amazon came out with a report saying that they are worried about the fact that they're going to run out of people by 2024.
Hmm.
I was stuck by that. What do you mean by that? I mean, so I looked into the article, and they are experiencing huge attrition. They are experiencing an attrition of about 3 to 4% a week, and somebody did the totaling, and it came to about 150% attrition every year.
Oh, wow.
In the warehouse business, the normal attrition is 45 to 50%. So Amazon is experiencing 3 times the attrition a normal benchmark on attrition is. So it made me pause and look at the data as what's really happening. And
Right.
there is some very contradicting issues that are creeping up. First is we're all aware of the great resignation. It spiked in November 2021 in terms of the fact that we have more opening than jobs. Huge talent shortage, and you can see that obviously affecting many of our lives. If you go to the airport, there's a strong chance that your flight is being canceled these days over the last few days, particularly in the US. While that is happening, I was looking at the trend in terms of Google search. The word great resignation obviously has been very popular, but it's starting to ease off. And its place, now you're starting to talk about the great restructuring, with many organizations starting to lay off people,
Hmm.
especially in the tech world. I mean, even Elon Musk has come back out and said, "Listen, I'm going to lay off people because I overstaffed." So I think especially in some of the industries, you over-engineered the workforce in the last few months because you were worried about staffing issues, and now, given the fact that we are perhaps going to be heading into a very dark moment in our economic history, there is going to be some kind of a rethinking on that equation. So that is happening as well. So you have great resignation, that is still not stopped. And the
Right.
interesting thing with the great resignation is 33% of the people who have left organizations have left without jobs. This is a McKinsey survey. So where are they going? And you can see that affecting us in hospitals. There's a nursing shortage. There is a pilot shortage. Certain professions, people are not coming back. And I think we have to understand what is really happening. And the third dimension to this is also very interesting, is in some of the industries that were traditionally certainly not affected by unionization, you're now starting to see unions becoming very active. Apple
Right.
has just organized some union for the first time, an Apple store in North Carolina. Amazon warehouses are organizing. The Starbucks I go to you at the University of Pennsylvania um, claims now that they are unionized. So you have an interesting cocktail of issues cropping up related to workforce. And my own feeling is that when we talk about what does it mean for leadership, you need to keep in mind that this is unreal. And I don't think we know where this is going to stop. Because the moment you have the great resignation, followed by the great restructuring, and when a recession happens or restructuring happens, people actually hunker down. They actually stop leaving because they want to have the safety net of a job. So you're going to stop seeing the great resignation. You're going to see the uptick in great restructuring. But the moment the economy comes back, you're going to see the resurgence of the great resignation once again because of pent up demand for people to go and try something else. So you're going to see these swings over the next few years. So if you were to look at the future of work is very dynamic. You're going to see resignation, restructuring over the next many years with all other complications like unionization all built into that equation. So it's going to be uh, 3, 4 cycles of shifts that we don't even know where it's going to land. So, actually, now you may assume or think that this makes me a little pessimistic, worried. I'm actually very optimistic because in these tectonic shifts that we are seeing, where we really don't have a clue, about what the context tells us, where the world is going, most people find solace within, not outside. In fact, you all know that Sheryl Sandberg left Meta a few weeks ago, or she's planning to leave Meta, and she had written this book on lean in, right? And if you look at the reason why she said she's leaving, she said, because I want to focus on my philanthropy work, and I want to focus on my foundation. It tells us that it's not, as far as Sheryl Sandberg is concerned, it's not about leaning in anymore. Maybe it's about leaning within more. And if it's leaning within, then I think that talks to the fact that there is a very interesting shift happening in the world. When we cannot control the outside, we need to start looking inside.
Yeah, that is so beautiful. That is so beautiful. You pointed to some really powerful shifts and trends that are going on right now in the business world. The unionization one, you're right, is actually one of the more fresher ones. Restructuring that is around the corner. I was at Heathrow Airport, just a couple of days ago, getting stuck in that lack of manpower, situation, with baggage claim taking 3 hours, before we were able to retrieve a baggage, and with no announcement, no update, no nothing. It's as if like the airport has just kind of completely given up, strained to the ultimate, and just given up on being able to be operationally efficient or even in any way accountable. um, I also want to highlight that when you combine this with social disruptions that are happening around us as well, right?
Yeah.
From the mental health crisis, the political and social divisions, the geopolitical challenges, the kind of the question about what is it that the role of businesses in society. Is it purely to produce investor return or something else? And well, what is that something else? And if some employees pull you one way and then others don't want to have you take an official position or change that much, or I mean, it's a tough spot that any of the leaders and managers of organizations today are placed in, both
Yeah,
from the
and
outside
very
and the
rightly
inside.
so, Hitendra. I think it's a real tough spot. In fact, I read a statistic which said 78% of the CEOs expect to be fired within the next couple of years. Imagine the tension
Yeah,
that they would be
yeah,
going
yeah.
through.
Now, Raghu, I have been studying these things more from the outside. I had humble steps in my career at McKinsey and doing startups, and then I ended up in business school 20 years ago. You had a long ride and a storied ride at one of the preeminent organizations of its time, a conglomerate, right? GE. So you've seen just a whole lot of these dynamics play out in past decades, and I'm just curious, can you put this in perspective for us, those of us who don't have that kind of experience as you do? Like, how close or far from normal is this? And or not, if not normal, I mean, there have been exceptional, moments in the past where change and uncertainty and all of that has been foisted on leaders, managers, and organizations. I mean, how different is it from, or is it different at all from cycles like this you've seen in the past?
I think the rate of change, as opposed to change, the content of change itself has picked up. So you're talking about great resignation till a month ago, and now you're talking about great restructuring, and then you're going to talk about great resignation once again in the next few months. I think that rate has picked up so fast that many leaders feel that they really don't control the environment anymore. So you got to live through a crisis has now become a core competency. It's not a peripheral skill. And
Right.
so you can think about the strategy, you can think about long-term plans, but you are actually caught by what happens to you at the end of the day when that message comes through and you don't anticipate it. And I think that is what is unnerving many people, because there is no template, and that's
Yeah.
why I call this phase the figure it out phase, not the find it out phase. And what do I mean by that? Find it out phase, you have something to fall back on. There is a template, there is a best practice, there is a benchmark, there is somebody who has done it before, and you can say, all right, I'm going to try that out. In a figure it out phase, even at an individual level, not just at an organization level. You have no clue. So you have to
Yeah.
experiment, you have to innovate, you have to pilot and test out the waters, and you really have no idea where it's going to end up. So I think the living on the edge, living on the flow of change, and leading on the flow of change is the new norm that I
Hmm.
would say all the next era of leaders need to grapple with. Uh, Things were a little better for us, not that it was perfect, but actually the next era of leaders need to grapple with the fact that they are living on the edge all the time, and it is an occupational hazard to lead organizations which are constantly in white waters.
Yeah, yeah. Let's then lean within, as you so thoughtfully put it, not just lean in, but lean within. It seems to me, Raghu, that in this context then of change being almost the inexorable, just unavoidable, daily, continual imperative, and one which, like you're saying, the pace is so searing that if I think about like the role of any decision maker, any leader, any person in a position of responsibility, um 70-80% of what you do in a day might be very programmatic, might be things based on how things have been done in the past, and you probably just are able to very comfortably operate by instinct, by past judgments, by uh, great clarity about pattern recognition and all you see around you. And then 20% of what you're doing now and then, you have to really go deep and slow down and be creative and soul search and assimilate from so many other sources and people. But today it seems like most of the things that you have to do, most of the things that are on your desk every morning, require more of that conscious, deliberate, thoughtful, and yet to your point, like you really don't even know which template to use. Experimental, evolutionary kind of. So it appears to me that it's possible that a number of leaders, with the pressures they face, the uncertainty, the need to bring in much more of cognition and engagement and thought and connection with people and collaboration. I mean, it is a recipe potentially, unless you're really rejuvenating from within, for burnout, for leadership burnout.
Many ways, absolutely correct. I think, and I'll go there. I think there's going to be an important discussion on that one. But you're right. The difficulty that many leaders have is that there is no templates. So they end up being prone to two kinds of biases. One is an expediency bias, and second is an experience bias. What do I mean by expediency bias? Expediency bias is when you want to solve the problem today and you come up with an answer. Okay, I'm going to declare a 3-2 kind of a framework for remote working. That's it.
Right.
And there is a blowback on that, right? And then experience bias is when you use your experience to continue to hark on to the old rather than pivot to the new. Say, my perception is that office from working from office is more productive than working from home. That's an experience bias that many of us are used to.
Right.
Right? So I think what ends up happening is that leaders get stuck, and they are now grappling with the need to make decisions, the need to move forward, and feeling stuck. And that is a real cause for tension and burnout because they don't know what to do. Damned if they did, damned if they didn't. I mean, a clear example of that is Apple, which perfectly came up with an idea. Okay, we're going to do 2 days people can work from home, and we're going to provide them flexibility, but 3 days they need to come to the office. And many organizations have done that. What's ended up happening is that over 70% of the employees in Apple push back. In fact, one of their senior leaders, Ian Goodfellow, resigned because he didn't want that. The open letter from the Apple employees actually says, I'm paraphrasing here, that you if you you allow us to decide what is best for us and allow us to do our best work in our lives. That is the open letter. So, what would you do if you say, okay, my stance is I'm going to allow you to come for 3 days to the office, and these are the dates. And employees say, no, we will decide which 3 days to come. That is not something that you know how to answer. So I think the lesson for and what does it do to the executive? Saying that, okay, my God, here are decisions I'm making. I don't know if I'm right or wrong. And if I'm wrong, I am now in a public square with Twitter or recordings and whatnot. and I'm being reprimanded publicly by my employees and in the society. So I think that is a cause for enormous tension, and therefore people are, in a gridlock in terms of how to approach this.
Yeah. You know, it strikes me this may be a great time for all of us to become students, like you have in the last few years. And one of the things, perhaps we can study is just how history could guide us about how in the past, iconic figures, people who have left a really positive, beautiful mark on humanity with their leadership, perhaps sometimes stretching over decades. How is it that they actually ended up comporting themselves at times when there was a fair amount of disruption and change, and they were actually pushing for some of that themselves, and therefore what are some of the practices they were engaged in that made them overcome this kind of expediency bias or experience bias? And I'm thinking about Lincoln's Civil War, I mean, obviously a hugely disruptive time, going through something unprecedented in America's history. And then you have like Gandhi and the movement he was trying to lead in India. Mother Teresa doing her work. Any and these are people, as are well loved by me in the research that I've been doing over the years, and which I've dedicated chapters to in the book. But I think there is a few things that we can turn to for advice and guidance to our inner circle of inspirational figures, like these.
No doubt. Hey, you write, so you write about that so eloquently in your book. It's the whole thing about wisdom is about finding your own internal markers, right? Working through you when you're facing such a dynamic environment where you really don't have answers, you're guided by your moral compass or compass. In fact, a few days ago, Tim Cook, I don't know whether you saw that kid, Tim Cook was giving a convocation or commencement address in one of the universities, and he said, in the future, those of us who want to lead need to start leading through an inner compass or a moral compass.
Ah, beautiful.
It's not about what will happen. It's not about what will happen. It's about who you will be when that happens that matters most.
Oh, how beautiful! How beautiful! How beautiful! It it links to something I like to say, which is great leaders are great followers. Typically when we have used that expression, which has been used at times in business, that leaders need to be followers. The frame for that has been followers of their people.
Mm,
But I think the frame we are talking about, which is what I prefer and I like to talk about also, and is that they are followers of their inner voice.
there you go.
They really engage in the discipline of listening and surrendering to that inner voice. And it moves me to share a story, Raghu, which is there's this American journalist who was very, inspired by Gandhi and his movement, and went over to meet him in India. And at some point, said, Mr. Gandhi, you speak so actively about the need to listen to your inner voice and be guided by it, and that it's so important to you. And a lot of people claim to follow their inner voice, sometimes to really dangerous and bad places, in what they take on and what they do, where it's quite clear that they were in some ways quite, quite delusionary. So he says, how do you know for sure, that it's the right voice, that is guiding you, and not some kind of wrong, misguided, whatever. And is it the case that you first really validate and prove to yourself that it's the right voice, and then you surrender to it? And Gandhi, the journalist reports later, he said, Gandhi looked at me as though, like, what? Like, is this all that you have understood about my movement, my teachings, my methods? Because it seems so far away from what I truly mean. And then he says, Gandhi actually explained his facial expression to me. He said, actually, it's the complete opposite. It's
Yeah.
not that you first have to convince yourself that it's your inner voice and then you surrender to it. It is the opposite. You first surrender. And it is in that act of surrender where you are beyond attachments and ego and insecurities
Uh,
and all that, that then you can feel secure that what you're listening to is actually your inner voice.
and I have that's so powerfully put. And one question I have is, maybe over the last 2 3 years, given what we have had to do as humanity, many of us may actually have done that. And that's what I'm excited about. That's why I call the age of unfolding. We may have started listening to our inner voice more. And what it has done is it is what about three shifts, and that goes straight into your book. For me, first is what I'm experiencing and seeing in the workforce is the first shift is a career life fit shift. And it's not I'm not talking about work life balance, career
Right.
life shift fit. What people are looking for is what are we working for, and more than that, what are we living for? And if they're basing their decisions on what are we living for,
Right.
it goes back to saying, is my career meeting my inner purpose? And while they may not be able to articulate that, somewhere along the line, I think the lamp has been lit
Right.
for them to say, okay, is this where I feel I belong, or is there something I need to do differently? And you can see that, right? Whether it's the nurses, they're not against the profession, they're against the career they're in, or the pilots, or many of us making the decision saying that I don't feel that this kind of a career is going to give me fulfillment, and I'm now going to let my life values determine my career, not the other way around. And I think
Right.
that's a powerful shift that I think people are experiencing, which is why, according to McKinsey, 33% of the people who are leaving due to the great resignation are leaving without jobs. They're doing their own stuff. They're starting their own consulting. They're starting their own gig work. They're embracing their passion and purpose. And I think it's the moment that has created the movement, so to speak. And I think it's a very powerful appreciation of the fact that as human beings, there is this inner stirring, inner trigger within us that has been lit on fire. So I think, I hope everybody gets to read your chapter on living with purpose and leading with purpose, because that is the source of how people are making their shifts and decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I've really over time realized is so critical is to make, idealism marry pragmatism, right? So each of us, on the one hand, from inside, has a certain heroic aspiration, a certain purity of purpose, and a desire to manifest beauty in some ways that are very personal to who we are. And at the same time, we are in this messy, muddy world, around us, whatever the conditions and the times that we live in. And sometimes people think that you're talking about the workplace, but I'm talking about just like every aspect of your outer life. I mean, because sometimes even one's family relationships and even the societal expectations around us, we're not like perfectly seeing ourselves fit in every which way with regard to the expectations and asks and desires of people around us. And so whether it's on the personal or professional side, sometimes that can be very messy and muddy, and that's the pragmatist that also needs to emerge, where so as I think about some of these things you're saying about the great resignation, people pulling back, going more to their core values and wanting to express them, I also wonder if along the way they'll discover like, oh wow, but I also need to make money. I do have a certain hunger for wanting to be liked and loved and applauded and rewarded, on the outside. And I kind of like miss some of that because like I'm trying to do my own thing, but I'm really struggling with making money. Or I joined this, I don't know, this organization with much more of a beautiful purpose, but it's not really doing financially as well. And because I've actually seen that. I've seen that with a couple of people, close at hand, who left to be pursuing a more idealistic career, then got grounded more on the pragmatism of what they felt they needed out of life financially and otherwise, and ended up kind of moving back, into a more mainstream corporate kind of thing, which really is not as, much a source of passion, for them, but is giving them the practical things that they want to. And I mean, one of the things I want to offer from that, one of the things I talk about in the book is that when we get more purpose driven, we also have to know what things to say no to. And part of that no is just like simplifying life, simplifying life so that if you can get to a point where you can be at peace, you can be happy with less, less consumption, less of a what's the minimum financial kind of requirement I have for my family and I to be, perhaps less cars, in the garage, or or whatever. You just, for those of us who are not, let's say, financially, completely free and independent, it's those kinds of disciplines that then actually make us very free. because the range of flexible options for us in life just start to dramatically expand. I don't know what you think of that.
I'll push back on that one, Hitendra. You're right in one sense and not so right in the other sense. And that's where our experience bias comes in. That's exactly how I thought, right? My thinking was, okay, we also need to put food on the table. So how do we reconcile the two? I was just reading yesterday that the Gen Z, which is those people born between 1997 and 2012 who are coming into the workforce, they are going to be 27% of the workforce in the next 3 years. And the key differentiators between them and the next generation, the previous generation, is the fact that these are people who don't trust institutions at all, because
Right.
they've gone through all that. Instead, they only trust on their skills. They said, I'll get my own badging, I'll get my own skills. And they are far more wiser to issues of inequity, inequalities. How do I make sure that I live my purpose? So they're making choices based on how they want to live. So, I read a quote from one youngster, which was fantastic. He said, listen, we know that these are some practical issues, but we also know that the pain is inevitable. However, suffering is a choice. So I will make the choices based on whether I want to suffer or not. And I would rather not suffer from a dead end job which gives me money than take up a job where I have more meaning than money. Yeah, will that put me at risk? Will that be make me an outcast in society? Will that make me live a life lesser than what I'm used to? Maybe it's worth the sacrifice. Your definition of success is frozen in time. Wake up. You need to see something different.
Yeah. Well, that's a very powerful shift. If that's actually happening, not just at an anecdotal level, but something more thematically across that generation. After all, I mean, at some level, we should all be, basically humble enough to realize that if you look at the history of the last like few hundred years, pretty much every generation at some level or the other has, in a positive way, outdone the previous one,
Mhm.
which is why we've ended up, even with all the, shaking and stirring that is happening today, we've ended up in a much better world today than we were 100 years ago. And that
Mhm.
was, quite a lot better than 200 years ago. So from that vantage point, this Gen Zs, I mean, another 30, 40, 50 years when they're taking over the world, they're probably going to create a much better world than ours.
And that's why I'm optimistic. And that's why I'm really optimistic. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
I have another shift to talk about, and this goes into the living with love and leading with love. And I think it's an understated phenomena that's happening. We are all preoccupied with the concept of well-being, right? And we now talk about well-being as the opposite of ill-being, which is the world is broken down, mental health issues, burnout issues, stress. Those are realities, no doubt about that. But if you look at what people are trying to do in terms of well-being, your book tacks on something else which is perhaps not fully leveraged, and I'll come to that. When we talk about addressing well-being, many people talk about, okay, let's talk about well-being in terms of the enjoyment that we all need to have. We need to go for the occasional ball game, or we need to go for the concert where we can enjoy ourselves, and that's a very human tendency. That also addresses well-being. And for a couple of years we were all locked up at homes, and now that the world is starting to come back, we are wanting to travel, we want to see new things and experience new things. There's another angle to well-being, which is around mindfulness, which is around gratitude, which is around sleep, and some of those things that basically calm you down. You pick up on a third aspect of well-being which is under leveraged, and that's love. When you share love, the feeling that you have of well-being actually dramatically increases, and you don't need any external machinery to do that. And when we talk about the word love here, we are talking about your definition here, which is sharing, being joyful in other people's joy. And I think and you see some of that stuff happening, but it's not brought to light. So if you hear of a story about a young lad who wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning to walk to work for 6 hours, the go front page now make sure that he gets a car or she gets a car. Or if you look at somebody, if you look at Ukraine, the kind of outpouring of love that we've had to many people. I was reading today that uh, almost all the psychiatrists and psychologists in Ukraine, in Israel, have gone out of their way. There was one lady of Israeli of Ukrainian origin who said, "I'm going to be helping out these people who are obviously going through trauma." And before she knew it, she could not meet the requirements and the demand. So she started asking for help. Now you have a huge number of psychiatrists who are helping the Ukrainian people navigate through their suffering. And one of the statements this lady made was, "It is meant more for me than for them." And I think the fact that you are able to contribute to the uplifting of humanity through your share of love and giving is a huge well-being lever. And that's why, as organizations look at what they need to do to address well-being, stress, I think there is a lot to be told about for volunteer work, making sure that you have the chance of benefiting somebody who's not as lucky as you. And addressing those issues is an untapped potential of well-being that we perhaps need to think more seriously. I don't know what you have to say to that. Linking
Yeah, I
love
mean,
and
I love it. I love it. One broad frame in which maybe we could place this, with the HR kind of hats, that we might wear for a minute, is intrinsic versus extrinsic, drivers of motivation. I mean, we have operated in business, for so long with the assumption that, people are economic maximizing agents, very rational, very much about optimizing, their financial and other similar material outcomes. And that's certainly an undeniable part of like the human, motivation system, and that's the external one. And yet at the same time, if that's the only one you operate with, at a team level, manager level, individual level, organizational level, you're just missing out on like, so much more richness there is, right, to human drives. And what you are just citing here, Raghu, is that, yes, one of those drives can actually be more of the resilience and meaning that the right purpose and alignment with your values can bring, which you just spoke about, and you talked about in an inspiring way how there are so many in Gen Z that are actually starting to activate that other alternative system of motivation. But then love is another of those motivation systems within us, where when the heart is on fire, then just fundamentally one is so driven to do like heroic and beautiful and selfless work, without necessarily the need to feel like you're going to reciprocally get like some material or psychic kind of like acknowledgement. I mean, it's funny, it reminds me of the story about Abraham Lincoln. He was once going with a senator, in a in a carriage somewhere, and he was asserting to the senator that basically human nature is fundamentally selfish. Fundamentally selfish. It's about serving one's own self. Now, this is someone we know in history is actually a remarkable figure for the very selfless leadership he had, Lincoln. But he was basically arguing for how selfish human nature is, and then at one point, the he noticed that there was a sow, like a female pig, right, and her two little piglets. And he saw that there was a marshy terrain, maybe that's been rained there recently, and these two little piglets were basically swirling in that marshy thing, kind of like almost being like sucked in by the swampy conditions, probably
Hmm.
to like drown and ultimately kind of die. And this sow, this pig, she was like really almost like shrieking in some kind of pain at seeing like the risk of losing her two little ones. And so Lincoln actually asks the carriage to pause, and then he steps out of it, and then he goes over there into those muddy marshy waters, rescues those two little piglets and puts them back in the safe refuge of their mother. And then he comes back, muddy and all, into the carriage, and the senator looks triumphantly at Lincoln, because he'd been having an argument, a debate about him, and he says, "See, Mr. Lincoln, he wasn't president at that time, but he says, see, Mr. Lincoln, you were wrong. Human nature is not selfish. If it was selfish, you wouldn't have done what you just did." And then Lincoln looked at him and said, "But I did it for me. I did it for me because I would have been so much in pain
Right.
if I had, allowed this moment to pass and
Hmm.
just ignored,
Beautiful story.
so I did it for my own joy, to
You
bring him
you
back.
also quote Rumi in the book, which says, love is the bridge to everything.
Yeah.
I think it's a very powerful notion of well-being. Love as an important source of well-being in everything we do. And the question is, can we be intentional? I tried this as an experiment, Hitendra. I must tell you this.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
said, what can I do this morning that exemplifies this value, right?
Okay. Okay.
And one of the things I did was one of my students has been going through a tough patch.
Hmm.
And having gone through a tough patch, she could not complete her assignments on time.
Okay.
um, I had two alternatives. I could say that, I'm going to fail you, or I can give her more time. I decided to give her more time,
Right.
and gave her some tips. And when she finished it, she sent it to me. I marked her grades today, and it, there were issues, and it was not perfect. What I did do was, if I were to lead with love as opposed to just give her a bad grade, what would I do differently?
Okay.
I'm using Hitendra's tricks here. So
Uh-huh.
I sent
Yeah.
her a note. I sent her a note saying that I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of you for having gone through what you've gone through and still coming up with what you did.
Hmm.
You had to work extra hard. You had to work more hours in the night while you were in classes to do what you need to do. And you produce an output, which I must say falls below my expectation. But
Yeah.
knowing the context with which you did it, I am overjoyed that you were able to pull this through. I'm
Ah,
going to
beautiful.
pass you, but keep in mind that my standards from you are going to only increase, and I'm here to support you through the journey. I felt so good after that. Forget whether she
Yeah.
received it well or not. The fact that I was able to exemplify. So it's a part for me. That was a moment of well-being.
Oh, that's so beautiful. That's so. Thank you for sharing that. What a great story, and I can only imagine, how she will be receiving it and how lasting an impact it will have on her. What you've just exemplified here, as you've said, is not just the broad kind of quality, of love, and how, as an experiment, you've discovered that in as selfless capacity, when you put it out there, it ends up benefiting you yourself. But I talk in the book about how sometimes we feel very paralyzed from acting upon that instinct. Much as we have great intentions and aspirations about what we want to do, we feel quite helpless about being able to have really any material impact
Right.
at times in the life of the suffering soul, who's in front of us, at times in the context of the causes that we really believe in, because they seem so, intractable and, large, and, and meanwhile, I'm just a drop in that ocean and all that. And so oftentimes many of us are not doing anything, or we struggle with, like, okay, how can I help this person? I mean, they just, let's say, for example, they just like lost a loved one. I mean, what is it that I can say or do right now which will ever be of any help to them, because I'm so like minuscule compared to this gravity of loss that they've just gone through. And the thing that I've learned through so many stories and studies like this is that actually it matters. It matters to put your love in action, even in small actions, even just a symbolic action. It may not be something that can materially, fully, and permanently and scalably change everything, what it is that is causing, need or hunger or pain or something, out there. But having put your love into some small, simple action, that was the message and the value that I see in the Mother Teresa's and all of that, right? I mean, they may not have been able to like cleanse the whole ocean, of humanity of like its ills, but whatever little drop, whatever little thing, for them that was significant and meaningful, and gave them peace of mind. And actually, more recently, just before I had to put the final kind of dotting of I and crossing of T's in the book, I actually came across very satisfyingly so some science which shows that you actually become more at peace with yourself when you have certain aspirations like that, and you just give some expression to them. It could be a simple expression, small expression, limited expression. In your case, Raghu, you can't fully turn around the life of this individual that you're talking about, but still you put your love into action.
That's it. The only question I would have for you, Hitendra, is there is an intentionality to it. You got to use that as a discipline. So in some ways, I'm wondering, love in action, purpose in action. Every one of the five things that we speak about in the
Yeah.
book, there is an intentionality, and maybe even beyond. Right? For instance, can you put empathy into action? Can you put curiosity into action in everything you do? And I'm actually reminded of one of the lessons we learned from Benj Franklin, right? That the 13 virtues. If we decide to pick one or two and exemplify that for that particular day, you can do all 13 of them. But I'm saying, even if you say, I'm going to be curious today, and every action that you have or you take is through the lens of curiosity. Or if you, because otherwise the default is on, unfortunately, we become victims of reactionary behavior, as opposed to intentional behavior. And therefore, as leaders, I think the future, the appeal I would have is, if you want to start from within, if you want to find the source of energy from within, I think we may need to be more intentional in some of these behaviors going forward.
Yeah, yeah. Um, very, very well put. Very well put. You reminded me of, I think there's a resource out there. I may not be able to immediately get it right here, but I can point us towards it, at least our listeners, which is, you're at UPenn, some great research, in the positive psychology movement, that has started from UPenn. And there's a list of 24 universal values. And I think that community at some point put up some resources about just helping give us examples of how do you, like you said, put creativity into action on, on a random day in your life. How do you put humility into action? How do you put transcendence into action? How do you put gratitude into action, etc.? And it's a great resource for those of us who are drawn to the idea of making these things very tangible and very expressed, in our daily lives. I want to acknowledge and welcome, those of us listening to the show live. Usually in the last several weeks and months, I have transitioned into sections, into more of a recorded, pre-recorded podcast. Today we wanted to, for a change, enjoy the opportunity to kind of, have much more live discourse between Raghu and me in the presence of those of you who could join us. I want to welcome and value and appreciate, those who've lent their voice already to the proceedings today. Mr. Mukherjee, Hemant, Robert, John, and Dana. Thank you for joining us. And others who might be listening in live, feel free to, use chat as a way to communicate and connect and say hello and share your thoughts. Share your thoughts as well. Beautiful. So I'm gonna wait to have Raghu. Okay, yeah, here you go, Raghu. Back to you. Where do you want to take the conversation next?
But the question I would have is, what does it mean? If on the one hand you have this whole swirl happening in the environment, if on the other hand people are becoming more intentional based on themselves, their inner source, what does it mean going forward? And I think that's where the two meet, right? The inner mastery as a toolkit for outer impact. I think
Yes.
that's where the two converge for me. And for me, the future of leadership, because we talk about the future of work, we talk about the future of the worker, the workplace, we hardly talk about future of leadership. And that is what I meant by the future of leadership is about unlearning. It's about unlearning management and relearning leadership, which means that we got to rethink our leadership from a human-centric point of view, and not necessarily from a business-centric point of view. We got to re-engineer that. And we've had, if you look at the greatest of leaders, whether it's Mandela or Gandhi or Lincoln, their success came from their human centricity, not from their outcome centricity. Right? The fact that they were able to create an environment where they were able to shift people's perspectives based on how they operated in a human-centric way is such a powerful example for us to use going forward in a very uncertain world, in a difficult world, in a traumatic world. So each of these leaders are perfect examples of those people who are dealing with complex, multi-layered, multi-dimensional, traumatic situations, but using their human skills as a vehicle for transformation. Because my big issue is, I think you see some of the people laying off leaders exemplifying more a transactional orientation. That is, and McKinsey came up with a study, right? They looked at what did leaders think about the Great Resignation. The leader said it's because of compensation, It's because of the fact that they want to work from home. Some people even said that's because they are lazy, blah, blah, blah. But
Mhm.
if you ask the employees why they are leaving the organization, McKinsey said the opposite. I'm not being valued by my manager. I'm not being valued by my organization. I feel the fact that I don't have a keen sense of belonging. So there you are. So you actually have a dichotomy, and leaders need to realize that they need to start the shift based on a human centric focus. In fact, Josh Bersin, who's an HR guru, did
Right.
a survey of 400 HR managers. And the conclusion they came to was that the future of organization is going to be human centric. At the end of the day, I mean, if you look at the biggest discovery we've had, is the future of work is not about artificial intelligence, machine learning, all that stuff. That'll happen. It's about people, and
Ah,
that's what
yeah.
we've gone through as worldwide. That's what we've gone through.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I want to sort of come back to the theme of love that you brought up. When these leaders, to your point, have been very human centric, um, what I find is that this is not merely an intellectual choice. This is not merely a an awareness that, look, this is what the world needs today. These folks were incredibly in love with humanity. I mean, in love with humanity. And then naturally so, that love starts to flow, that dedication, that commitment, that purpose starts to flow, that attunement, that empathy, that compassion, the connection, all that, because they're just deeply in love. And you can't be in love unless there is something about the other side that you are in awe of, that you find magical, that you
Mhm.
find really pure and beautiful and soaring, and you feel very connected to it. I mean, without those conditions, how can you be in love? If it's like all you can see is messiness and
Right.
you know lack of trustworthiness and laziness and all of that, right? And so in some ways I felt like one of the seeds we have to sow in our lives is this capacity to live in a state of appreciation. And I'll give you an example. Steve Jobs it's not been traditionally considered in mainstream consciousness to be one of these love oriented leaders, but actually, I mean, I see him as a tremendous force of love that were expressed through many of his actions in unique ways. We may have only so much time to go through something of that here today, so more of that to be read if you read the chapter on living with growth in my book. But one of the things I discovered from his journey, when we think about all the genius that he was able to unleash, in terms of creativity and design and innovation and all of that, where did it come from? Where did it start? Was it because he just had like some tremendous like insight into the future of products and technology and all that? No. The place where it started from, what was different between a Steve Jobs and other technologists of his time and other folks who were kind of doing innovations in his time, what was different about Steve Jobs is he really believed in humanity. He believed that within every human being lay somebody with high design sensibilities, somebody who would choose, if they were given the choice, to go for something which was highly well designed, gave a simple and beautiful and compelling user experience, even if it cost hundreds of dollars or more than
Mhm.
the traditional mainstream product there. Because that's what he did, right? The cost of phones was going down and down and down. The Nokias and Motorola's from 200 to 150 to 100, and they were fighting over how many more features and how many more buttons to put on those phones. Incredibly complex devices. You needed all kinds of orientation and training before you could use any of them. But as consumers, we weren't really thinking very much about like what's the alternative. This is kind of like the world. We want the price to go down, and we kind of want more features, and it's just going to be messy and complicated. And
Right.
then he pierces through all of that into our soul, and he sees at the level of our soul in humanity somebody who's really able to make good design away from poor design, and is
Right.
able to choose good design. And then he tells his people, go ahead and design this and do this. And then he introduces the product in the market at a price point which is a multiple 3x, 4x the cost of an average phone. And typically the logic has been that that's a premium play. It will attract a certain luxury segment because it's 3x, 4x the normal price, right? But
Right.
instead, he doesn't sacrifice market share. He actually dominates market share with a 3x, 4x premium price product, right? So he completely destroys that trade-off that we find actually in, price demand kind of elasticity, right? Where price is high, demand is high, because he actually activated another dimension of who we are, right? Because he was in love with humanity. He saw possibilities in us that nobody else was seeing, including sometimes our own selves, right? Gandhi saw the same thing. He saw peace in people, whereas everybody else said, well, when there's a revolution, then people will be very bloody and fighting oriented. But Gandhi saw peace even while there was a revolution to be done.
Right.
Mother Teresa saw compassion in people and evoked it and drew it out even of like feared dictators who would like eat from her hands and say, Mother, you remind me of my grandmother, and say, okay, come here, bring your sisters. And others were shivering in their skins about being in front of the, at that time, like the Sandinista rebel, leader, General Noriega, who I have a story about in the book, Mother Teresa and him and all of that. So
Yeah.
anyway, I mean, I just wanted to kind of offer that up, that you make a great point about human centered and human, but a lot of this human thing starts from like, what's your relationship with humanity?
There you go.
Do you see positivity and beauty and magic in people? Because if you don't, then maybe that's the first place we all have to start.
Agreed. And I think what you tell me, what you said just now also reminds me, is leadership about pushing, or is leadership about pulling in? And what do I mean? Most of us assume that if you are a leader, you have to push, 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 success, execute, get things done, make sure that you get people to do their most for you. But if you are the Mother Teresa, if you are the Steve Jobs, you pull people into your orbit, and they become leaders, not because they proclaim themselves to be leaders, not because they have the position of a leader, but because they pull people into their orbit and make them change makers, right? So in many ways, I think uh, that is the shift that we have to see in all of us. I think the younger age group, I'm very optimistic about the next generation of people demanding that there is a different world out there. Now, it'll be a pity if we fail them, because that means that we are reverting back to old. But I'm actually, they are far more activist oriented than we ever were. And I think they will demand and drive for the change for the world to be better.
Yeah, yeah. I'm with you. I mean, I feel a sense of optimism as well. I think that sometimes the path of evolution is incremental, and it's about learning and mastering the tools of the trade, and getting to find an inside route, towards ultimately being an agent of reform. And sometimes there are moments that come where you realize that actually so much of the old order needs to be dismantled, that it might be better just to start from scratch and just like start building new systems and new ideas and new approaches. And I think I'm seeing a little bit of that, happening now, which is what is accelerating change. That it's no longer spend, 5 years and then 10 years and then 15 years and then incrementally add your little imprint, to the world in law or in medicine or something. But the possibility today of just complete reinvention, starting from scratch with certain more fresh ideas, core building blocks that are out there in society, those possibilities are there. And I wonder, I mean, I'm fascinated about when we look back, 20, 30 years later, 40 years later, to see what kind of constructive, positive revolutions were wrought, on us.
Correct. Correct. I think I think on that note, we need to close it, because while the world may look difficult and troublesome, I think something good will emerge out of this whole equation. And from that point of view, all of us are going to become a lot more reflective, a lot more thoughtful. We're going to be guided by our experience, but also by our inner voice as we go forward.
Ah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Lincoln, in the midst of all the crisis and the criticism that was being hurled at him, some saying you're going too fast and others saying you're going too slow, he said, look, I just want to conduct the affairs of the state so that at the end of the day, I may have lost every other friend on earth, except that one friend who is deep down inside of me, you know and so that potential is there for all of us to strengthen. And in fact, that's my greatest wish for the next generation. The greatest wish, that don't listen to your friends, don't listen to me, don't listen to Raghu, anyone, but develop a really strong, clear, humble, open, surrendering attitude towards attunement with the universe and with nature as it expresses itself to you through the subtle stirrings that arise within, right, through the inner voice.
Indeed.
And
Indeed.
if that is what we can gift, as perhaps our message and our guidance, to the next generation, I think what a lifelong asset they would have with them to kind of help.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. Raghu, it's been a great joy to have you with us. You always are so replete and rich with new stories, new statistics, new perspectives and things. And it's so refreshing every time we have a
Thank you.
conversation. I know we've had a couple of them in the past and intersections, and now this one here today. Very, very grateful, and good luck in your new role at UPenn as well. You're stewarding a really important, you know, um, responsibility in taking the learning officers in organizations and really helping them, just kind of learn the most cutting edge of what it is that we can today offer for advancing human potential in organizations. So excited for the journey that you're ahead, that you're going on, and looking forward to your book coming out once you
Someday.
have it conceived and
Someday.
written.
Thank
Yeah.
you. And
What, Raghu, just to close it out, what would you likely think it'll be on? Your book, your first book.
it'll be. I think how HR practices need to change to be a lot more human centric.
Hmm. Yeah.
And this is out of 38 years of corporate life, right? And
Mm.
I feel now I look at the lay of the land, and having had the last 2 3 years to think this through, I know the many things that I did wrong, and out of that comes wisdom, right? You calibrate what you're learning through the eyes of your battle scars and what you've gone through,
Yeah.
and you realize and appreciate the fact that there could be another way.
Oh,
And
yeah.
hopefully, I'll be focusing on what the other way will be.
Yeah, and it's such a beautiful way through which to channel positivity through one's own at times kind of errors of the past, which is like, okay, it is because of my errors that future generations will not make errors if I can actually codify and help create some teaching and learning out of it, so humanity on the whole grows from the investment that was made in my life experience.
Exactly.
Yeah, how
That is
beautiful.
how that goes.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you for the opportunity and good luck with the book, Hitendra.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. Dana, feel free to reach out to me. I know there were a couple of unanswered questions and what you had here as well. Very grateful to all of you. Thomas, thank you for joining us as well today. And good luck with all that you're doing in life. If you're interested, feel free to check out Inner Mastery, Outer Impact, my book that has just been recently published, and look forward to Raghu's in the next several months as well. Take care. Bye bye.